Book of Heaven, Volume 17, Part 8. February 15th, 1925. The divine will in heaven is confirming, beatifying, bearer of happiness, divinizer. On earth, in the soul who lives in it, it is operating and forms eternal waves that overwhelm everything and place everything it contains in motion. I was abandoning all of myself in the most holy will of God, and in this total and full abandonment, I felt a new heaven within me, an air all divine that infused new life in me. And my always lovable Jesus, moving in my interior, seemed to be stretching out his arms toward me, to receive me and hide me within himself, placing me under this new heaven of his will that by his grace had formed in me. With great contentment, I breathed the balsamic and sweet air of his most holy will, and taken by amazement, I said, "My love, my Jesus, how beautiful is the heaven of your will! How enjoyable it is to be under it! Oh, how refreshing and salutary is its celestial air!" And Jesus, pressing me more tightly to himself, told me, "Daughter of my will, each act in my will is a new heaven that extends above the head of the soul, one more beautiful than the other. The air of these heavens is divine, and brings with itself sanctity, love, light, fortitude, and contains all tastes together. This is why one feels a balsamic and sweet air. My will in heaven is confirming, beatifying, bearer of happiness, and all-pervasive, transformer, and divinizer of everything within itself. On the other hand, in the soul who possesses these new heavens of my will on earth, my will is operating, and as it operates, it delights in extending new heavens. Therefore my will works and operates more in the pilgrim soul than in the celestial Jerusalem. Up there, the works of the saints are accomplished. There is nothing left to do, while here, my will has always something to do in the soul in whom it reigns. This is why it wants everything for itself, nor does it want to leave even one act to her human will, because it wants to do much. And for every act it were to surrender to the human will, it would fail to extend one more heaven, and it would be one work less for it. Ah, you do not know what happens in the soul when she gives my will all the freedom to operate within her, and the soul operates in my will. Imagine the sea when the waves rise up as so powerful and high that the power of the waves transports not only the waters, but also the fish up high, in such a way that in those waves one can see, carried by the power of the storm, how the fish also have come out from the bottom of the sea, from their everyday dwelling, to rise up high together with the waves. The waves have overwhelmed them, and they have not been able to resist their power, while without the power of the waves, they are unable to go out of their harbor. Oh, if the sea had a power without limit, it would make all the water overflow from the bed of the sea, forming gigantic waves, with all the fish overwhelmed within them. But what the sea cannot do, because it is limited in its power, my will does. As it makes the acts of the soul its own, by operating in her, it forms its eternal waves in her, and within these waves it overwhelms everything. In these waves, one can see what my humanity did, the works of my celestial Mama, those of all saints, and everything that the very divinity did. Everything is placed in motion. My will is more than sea. Our works and those of the saints can be symbolized by the fish that live in the sea. When my will operates in the soul, and also outside of the soul, everything that is present in it moves and rises. All works place themselves in order to repeat for us glory, love, adoration. They pass before us as though in a parade, saying to us, "We are your works. Great and powerful you are, because you made us so beautiful." My will encloses everything that is beautiful and good, and when it operates, it leaves nothing behind, so that nothing of what is ours may be missing in that act, and so that our glory may be complete. And there is nothing to be surprised about, because it is the eternal operating that is carried out in the soul. Therefore, the operating of my will can be called eternal wave that overwhelms heaven and earth as though in one single point, and then diffuses over all as bearer of a divine act. Oh, how heaven delights when it sees the eternal will operate in the soul. In fact, since their works are confirmed in the divine will in heaven, they see their works flow within that divine act, and feel their glory, happiness, and joys being redoubled. Therefore, since you are the little daughter of my supreme volition, I recommend to you, leave each act of yours prey to the eternal waves of my will, so that, as these waves reach the foot of our throne in heaven, we may confirm you more and more as our true daughter of our will, and we may grant you charters of grace for your brothers and our children. February 22nd, 1925. How in creating man, God formed many paths in order to facilitate his entrance into his will, and therefore into the celestial fatherland. I was thinking about the holy divine volition, and I prayed my lovable Jesus that by his goodness he would give me the grace to fulfill his most holy will in everything. And I said, "You who love and want that your will be done, help me, assist me, and feed me this will of yours in every instant, so that nothing else may have life in me." Now, while I was praying, my sweet Jesus moved in my interior, and clasping me tightly to himself, told me, "My daughter, how my heart is wounded by the prayer of the one who seeks only my will. I hear the echo of my prayer that I did when I was on earth. all my prayers reduced themselves to one single point: that the will of my Father be fulfilled, both upon me and upon all creatures. This was the greatest honor for me and for the Celestial Father, that I did His most holy will in everything. By doing the will of the Eternal One, always and in everything, my humanity opened the paths between the human will and the divine that had been closed by the creature. You must know that, in creating man, the divinity formed many paths of communication between creator and creature. Paths were the three powers of the soul: the intelligence, the path in order to comprehend my will; the memory, the path in order to remember it continuously; the will, in the middle of these two paths, formed the third path in order to take flight within the will of his Creator. The intelligence and the memory were the support, the defense, the strength of the path of the will, that it might not stagger either to the right or to the left. Path was the eye, that he might look at the beauties and the riches present in my will; path the hearing, that he might hear the calls, the harmonies present in it; path the word, in which he might receive the continuous outpouring of my word, Fiat, and the goods that my Fiat contains; path the hands, so that by raising them in his works in my will, he might come to unifying his works with the works of his Creator; path the feet, to follow the steps of my will; path the heart, the desires, the affections, to be filled with the love of my will and rest in it. See then how many paths there are in the creature in order to come into my will if he wanted to. All paths were opened between God and man, and by virtue of our will, our goods were his. After all, he was our son, our image, a work come out of our hands, and from the ardent breath of our bosom. But the human will, ungrateful, did not want to enjoy the rights to our goods that we gave to it. Not wanting to do our will, man did his own, and by doing his own, he put bars and fences across these paths. He constrained himself within the miserable circle of his will. He lost ours, and went wandering in the exile of his passions, of his weaknesses, under a tenebrous sky, loaded with storms and with thunders. Poor child, in the midst of so many evils, wanted by himself. So each act of human will is a bar that he puts across mine. It is a fence that he forms to prevent the union of our wills, and the communication of goods between heaven and earth is interrupted. My humanity, compassionating and loving man with infinite love, by doing the will of my Father in everything, kept these paths whole, and impetrated the removal of the bars and the destruction of the fences that the human will had formed. And so it opened the paths again for whomever wants to come into my will, to give back to him those rights wanted by us, with which we created him. paths are necessary in order to facilitate the journey. They are the means for man to be able to make, very often, a little visit to his celestial fatherland. And knowing how beautiful his fatherland is, and how happy one is in it, he loves it and yearns to take possession of it, and therefore he lives detached from the exile. These paths in the creature were necessary so that very often she might rise to her true fatherland, she might know it and love it. And a sign that the soul is on these paths, that she loves her celestial fatherland, is that, placing herself on the way in our will, she makes her little visits. This is also a sign for you. Don't you remember how many times you took the way to heaven and penetrated into the celestial regions? And after you had made your little visit, my will made you descend into the exile? And since you loved the fatherland, the exile seemed ugly and almost unbearable to you? Your love for the fatherland, your feeling the bitterness of living in exile, was a good sign for you that the fatherland is yours. See, this happens also with the low things of this world. If one has a large property, he forms a path in order to go visit it very often, to enjoy it, to take the goods that are in it, and while visiting it, he loves it and carries it in his heart. On the other hand, if he does not form a path, he never visits his properties, because without a path, it is almost impenetrable. He never speaks about it. This is a sign that he does not love it, and that he despises his own goods. And even though he could be rich, because of his bad will, he is a poor one who lives in the most squalid misery. This is why, in creating man, my wisdom wanted to form the paths between me and him, to facilitate for him sanctity, the communication of our goods, and his entrance into the celestial fatherland. March 1st, 1925. How each additional act that the soul does in the divine will is one more filament of light that renders the light within her more intense, more strong, and more bright. What true light is. I was feeling very embittered because of the loss of my sweet Jesus. Oh, how I miss my past! How his lovable presence used to make my poor existence happy. Even in the midst of the hardest pains, my poor bed was a little paradise for me. I felt like a queen together with my lovable Jesus, dominator of myself, and through the continuous contact with him, I felt as though dominator of his very divine heart. And now how my happiness has changed. Or rather, every time I search for him and do not find him, unhappiness surrounds me. It tears a stretch of my life away from me, because Jesus alone is my life, and I feel more vividly the pains of my hard exile. Oh, how true it is that it is not the pains that render the creature unhappy, but the good that is wanted and is not found. And while I was saying to him, "Have pity on me, do not abandon me, Come, rise in, my poor soul, immersed in the bitter waters of your privation. I felt my beloved good, my sweet life, move in my interior, and extending his arms around my neck, he said to me, "My daughter, my daughter." I looked at him coming out from a foundation of light, and as Jesus extended his arms, the light extended after him. However, that light was not completely full. One could see a void within that very light. But even though a void could be seen, it was not darkness. It was as if more filaments of light were needed in order to render that void more full, and the light more intense, more strong, and more bright. At the sight of Jesus, I felt myself rising again from death to life. His words, my daughter," changed my unhappiness instantly, because being with Jesus and being unhappy is impossible. At the most, one might be with Jesus in suffering, amid the most atrocious pains, but unhappy, never. Even more, it seems that if there is any unhappiness in the soul, it flees from the presence of Jesus, giving place to happiness that he brings with himself. Then, resuming his speaking, he told me, "My daughter, courage, do not fear. There is no darkness in you, because only sin is darkness, while good is light. Don't you see how I have come out, a foundation of light, from within your interior? But do you know what this light is? It is all the interior operating that you do. Each additional act you do is one more filament of your will that you bind to the current of the eternal light, and that filament turns into light. So the more acts you do, adding more filaments, the more full, intense, and bright the light shall become. Therefore, what you have done is the light that you see, and what is left for you to do is the void that you see within that same light. And I shall remain always in the midst of this light, not only to enjoy it, but to bind the filaments of the human will to the current of the eternal light, because I am the origin, the foundation, the current of the light. But do you know what true light is? True light is the truth. The truth known, embraced, loved, and put into practice by the soul is the true light that transforms her into light itself and causes new and continuous births of light to be placed inside and outside of her. This truth forms the true life of God within the soul, because God is truth, and the soul is bound to the truth. Even more, she possesses it. God is light, and she is bound to the light, and is nourished with light and with truth. However, while I nourish the soul with truth and with light, she must keep the current of her will open in order to receive the current of the divine communication. Otherwise, it can happen as with the electric current, to which its own electrical characteristics are not enough. The light is lacking. The preparations are needed in order to receive it. And still the light does not reach everyone equally, but according to the light bulbs they have. Those who have one receive one light. those who have 10 receive light for 10. And if the light bulbs contain more electric filaments, the lamps appear as more full of light. If they have less filaments, even though there is room inside the glass, the light is small. And even if the place where the current comes from can give more light, one does not receive it, because the strength of the electricity, in order to receive it, is lacking in the light bulbs. Therefore, it takes the celestial current that wants to give, as well as the human current, in order to receive it. And according to your operating, you shall add more filaments to render more complete the light I want to enclose within you. March 8th, 1925. Everything that Jesus did, both for the glory of the Father and for the good of creatures, remained deposited in the divine will, that preserves it all in act, with all its effects. I was saying to myself, how I wish I could go through all the ways of the eternal volition, to be able to find all the acts of this supreme will that came out of it for the good of the whole human family, so as to be able to place an act of my will for each act of its will, to requite it with my love, with my gratitude, with my thank you, for myself and in the name of all my brothers. But how can I find all these acts of the divine will? I, who am so little, so insignificant? Now, while I was thinking about this, desiring to embrace, to place one kiss of mine, or at least one I love you of mine, for each act of the supreme will, I felt my sweet Jesus move in my interior, and a light within my mind saying to me, "My daughter, do you want to go through all the acts of my will that came out of it for the good of all creatures? Come with me into my humanity. I long for it. I want you to do it. You must know that my humanity covered all the paths of the eternal volition, and in all the acts I found, done for the good of all my brothers, I omitted my own, to requite the divine will for its many acts done for the good of all human generations. This was the most legitimate act that befitted me to do, as the first honor of my celestial Father. And as I kept doing it, I left the deposit of my acts in the divine will itself, that they might remain always an act of giving to my divine Father this legitimate honor that creatures do not give him, and of forcing the eternal will to make peace with the human will. The will also in the creature is the deposit of all her thoughts, of the good and of the evil she does. It is the depository of everything. It lets nothing escape which it does not deposit within itself. Now, my humanity had two wills, the human and the divine, and everything I did, I deposited in the divine, not only to find all the acts done by the supreme will and to requite it, but to do more new acts of divine will, in order to form in it, with the whole operating of my humanity, a new creation, leaving it deposited within it, that it might preserve it whole, ever new and beautiful, without increasing or decreasing, being not subject, as much as creatures might take of it, to suffering the slightest diminution. Just like in the creation of the heavens, of the sun, of the stars, and of many other things created by the divinity for the good of the whole human family, everything was left deposited in our supreme will, so that it might preserve them always in that state in which they were created by us, as indeed it does. In the same way, I entrusted to it the whole operating of my humanity, so that everything I did might remain always in the act of giving itself to creatures. My operating is more than new heavens, suns, and stars, and just as the sun that is above your horizon does not refuse to give light to all and to give itself to each one, and if the human eye does not take all the immensity of its light, it is because the circumference of the eye is small, or rather, the eye takes more light according to how sharp and good its sight is, even though the sun remains in the act of wanting to give the whole of itself. In the same way, the new creation of my acts, all done in this divine will and deposited in it, in order to redeem and restore the creature, are in the act of giving themselves to all, and more than sun, stars, and heavens, they extend above the head of all, so that all may take the great good that they contain. However, there is a great difference between the sun that shines in the azure heavens and the one contained in the azure heaven of my humanity. In the first one, as much as the eye strives to look in order to be filled with light, its circumference does not expand. It remains always as it is. While the eye of the soul, the more it strives to look, to cooperate, to know, to love all that my humanity has done, the more it expands. It receives more light, it comprehends more, and takes more goods. Therefore, it is in the soul's power to be richer or poorer, more filled with light and heat, or colder and filled with darkness. Now, if you want to cover the paths of the eternal volition, enter through the door of my humanity. In it you shall find my divinity, and the divine will shall make present to you, as though in act, everything it has done, does, and shall do, both in creation and in redemption and sanctification. And you shall have the contentment of being able to kiss those acts, and to place in them your little act of love, of adoration, of gratitude. You shall find them all in the act of giving themselves to you, and you shall love them, and shall take the gifts of your celestial Father. Greater gift he could not give you, that is, the gifts, the fruits, the effects of his will. But you shall take them according to how much you cooperate, and let your will live dissolved within mine. Then for a little while I felt all of myself in Jesus, and I seemed to find in him, as though in act, all the operating of the divine will for the good of creatures. I tried to follow, one by one, the acts of the supreme will, but while I was doing this, everything disappeared. The delirium of wanting to find my sweet Jesus again made me agonize. Then, after many hardships, I felt him behind my shoulders, extending his arms toward me and taking my hands in his. With violence I pulled him to the front, and with all the bitterness of my soul I said to him, "Jesus, you do not love me anymore." And he immediately giving me no time to say anything else, told me, "My daughter, what? To me you say you do not love me anymore?" These words can be spoken to creatures, but not to your Jesus, to He who can never fail in love. And while he was saying this, he fixed on me, deep inside, as if he wanted to find something in me that interested him very much. And he kept looking and looking. Finally, I felt another Jesus come out from within my interior, all similar to the one outside. I remained surprised in seeing that my Jesus was inside of me and outside of me. And he, all goodness, told me, "Tell me, my daughter, who formed this new life of mine in you? Is it not love? Are they not my loving chains that not only formed me within you, but keep me bound and clasped to you? And so that this life of mine might always grow within you, I placed in you my eternal will. And as it is one with yours, we nourish ourselves together with the same celestial food, in such a way as to make my life one with yours. And with all this you say, you do not love me anymore." I remained confounded, and did not know what to say. You have reached the end of the Book of Heaven, Volume 17, Part 8. Fiat.